It's my pleasure to introduce Fiona Sloothaak from Eindhoven University of Technology, who's our today's speaker. Fiona obtained her PhD in 2020, and she was also in 2020 awarded the Applied Probability Trust Prize for excellent scientific achievements. Since then, Fiona held the postdoctoral position in the Department of Industrial Engineering and Innovation Science in Eindhoven, and she is now an assistant professor in the Department of Mathematics and Computer Science. Today, Fiona will talk about cascading failures in networks, and I very much look forward to Fiona's talk. I should say that I dropped the link to the slides in the chat, so if you want to keep an eye on those there. And Fiona, please start.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Could you, thanks, Eva, muting again. So thank you for the kind introduction, and very many thanks to all the organizers for inviting me to give a talk here. It's a great pleasure. Maybe a note up front, if there are any clarifying questions already in the audience, please do ask them during the talk, but maybe the questions that really invite discussion, maybe you save them to the end of the talk. As Eva mentioned, today I will speak about emergence of heavy tails in stochastic networks through cascading failures. So there are already two, three topics in the title that I will address. So for example, the heavy tails, emergence of them in stochastic networks, and related to it also cascading failure models. And I will try to give a more broad overview of what is happening in this field, and not only focus on my own work, but of course it will be in this presentation. So let's get started. So what are cascading failures? Well, since a picture often says more than 1,000 words, I typically explain them through this domino effect. So there's an initial disturbance or initial failure that kind of goes through the entire network in this domino effect. So if you look at, for example, a network, how can you see that? There are all these nodes on those edges that have a certain, possibly limited capacity. So in this example, I say that the edges have a certain limited capacity, and that immediately also implies some notion of how loaded those edges are. So how much of that capacity is already used through, for example, a certain flow that is directed into it. And of course, to start a cascade, there should be some initial disturbance. For example, an additional loading of the entire network, or a certain line, or maybe even a failure. Like this. And in that case, if that happens, then there's more pressure, more load into the node, into the rest and the remaining of the system. For example, these lines are even more loaded, and then cascade can really occur in cascading fashion. So more failures occur, possibly leading even to disconnections in the network. So the key interest here is, well, in a very broad sense, what is the failure size? So, for example, the number of failed edges, or the number of failed nodes, or amount of lost flow that was running through those through this network, and many more. And that just simply depends on the application area that you are looking at. So so this notion has a wide range of application areas. For example, computer networks where network traffic is severely impaired or halted through the overloading of a single or several crucial routers, for example, or nodes. We see them in material sciences, where you can think of an example. For example, I actually have that, a piece of paper. If you use a lot of force, it's very difficult to tear that apart. But if there is already initial tear somewhere, there's not that much force needed anymore. So that's really a cascading effect. Also in biochemical cascades, where an initial toxic chemical can really spread through the system. and maybe also very clear examples in power grids where large-sized blackouts can occur due to cascading failures. So this is particularly very problematic if the failure sizes are very large. So you can think of, well, the examples that we gave before. So failures are very undesirable, of course, and large failure sizes are something we really, really want to prevent. And that is problematic when they're heavy tailed. So if the tail of the probability of large failure size is heavier than any exponential. So how can you view that? Well, I explain it typically through comparing a Pareto tail with an exponential tail. So if you plot that on a log-log plot, then you see a straight line for the Pareto tail. And you see that high values of that failure size, say, is much more likely to occur than for an exponential tail. So conclusion is that large size failures are no longer virtually impossible events, and that's something that is not really very great. But unfortunately, it does happen in reality. So for example, this picture is from blackout data, historical blackout data. It's a little bit long ago, maybe more over a decade, but still I keep using it, where you see that there's a power law fit on the blackout data. For example, over here, you see this straight line that fits quite well on the blackout size, which is the amount of lost power. And even also, if you look at the blackout size in terms of the number of affected customers, you see that there's a reasonable fit for the power law behavior. Okay. The central question here is, why do these heavy tails occur, and how do they occur in cascading failure models? In the remainder of the talk, I will first try to give a list of explanations why heavy tails emerge, and then illustrate them where these heavy tails emerge in stochastic networks through cascading failures. And I will give several examples from literature and also include some of my own work there. And I will briefly end this talk with new possible directions for a specific cascading failure model, because I don't think I have more time than that. Emergence of heavy tails. So as I created those slides, I tried to start making a list of all possible explanations that you can think of. And it got really ridiculous. So I focused on 6, which has most to do with cascading failures, or where there is a certain beauty and elegance in it. So this list is very, very biased by my own personal preferences and view. So please don't judge me on this list. So a first explanation, or more maybe a way where we see heavy tails emerge, is in terms of random walks. It's where we, I think as a community, also look at heavy tails the most, and the most research is done on that. We already see that, for example, when we look at the generalized central limit theorem. So basically, a random walk is an additive process. As we learn in our undergraduate years, if you scale random variables that have finite mean and finite variance, then you go to Gaussian. But if you look at the generalized central limit theorem, you see that there are many, many more options possible. And particularly, if you start with regularly varying distributions, then if you scale that properly, which is done actually quite explicitly, can be done quite explicitly, you end up with a limiting distribution that is also heavy-tailed, actually also regularly varying. So if you'd like to know more about that, I give you some background notions. I copied this theorem actually almost literally from the latest book, or newly published book by Neer, Weerman, and Zwart. But this work was initiated more by Levy in almost a century ago, I believe. 98 years. So by Levy, who actually was the first to look at central limit theorems beside the Gaussian notion. But maybe the first time where we, as mathematicians that start their studies, we see heavy tail distributions is when we consider first passage times for random walks. So if we look, for example, the first passage time over a constant boundary, then the first, then you see that the Pareto tail actually appears with exponent -0.5. And we show that typically for symmetric simple random walks or exponential increments, you can really explicitly give that constant that goes in front of it. So if you want to know more about it, I also give some background notions here. So yeah, it started this line of research by Dansker and Skorrelgat already in the 1950s, where they showed the conversions of the random walk to a Brownian motion. This was much more generalized throughout the years, also considering alpha stable random walks, over moving boundaries, etc., etc. So there are many different type of generalizations that have been considered, and I could give a longer list. So also please note that this is not an exhaustive list. So that's in terms of random walks. A second explanation where we see heavy tails emerge is as a consequence of a certain phase transition. And a very typical example that you can think of is, for example, in branching processes, where there's an individual that gets a number of children according to some distribution that is independent and identically distributed, and it's every generation, each child that exists, reproduces a number of children for the next generation. And what you are interested in, for example, is the total progeny. And there are three possible cases that you can distinguish, namely in terms of the mean of the number of children. So if the mean mu is, for example, smaller than 1, then almost surely the total progeny is finite. If mu is larger, then you have the supercritical case where there's a positive probability that the total progeny is infinite, but there's this phase transition at exactly mu is 1, where you see this Pareto tail again, or power law tail, whatever you want to call it, popping up for the total progeny. Okay. So a third way where, a third way where heavy tails emerge is by a very, well, I find it very elegant way, by this fixed point equation that we see over here, or maybe a recursive relation, as you can view it as well, where you see that even if that A and the B are light-tailed, then you can still end up eventually that the X, that the stationary distribution of this relation actually goes to a power law distribution. And there are not even that strong condition for it. So for example, you need a positive probability that A can be larger than 1, but still, so the technical conditions, I won't go into it, but it's a very elegant and beautiful way where you see that even though the input is not even heavy-tailed, you can still end up with a heavy-tailed distribution for the X. So more background, of course, is for the can be found in the first work of Cascading in 1973, and then more textbook treatment of that is by this book. A fourth explanation or way that heavy tails emerge is where we see that in network topology, where we see that the degree distribution are also heavy tailed, and that is often linked to a preferential attachment model where that is used to explain, for example, the phenomena that the rich get richer or that the popular become more popular that we see in social networks, where a new individual tends to follow or like persons that already have a lot of friends or a lot of followers. Okay, So this work has really been initiated by Barabasi and Albert in 1999, quite recently, and it's a very active research field. Textbook treatment of it is, I would refer to the book of Van der Hofstad. Finally, well, second to last explanation, I would consider that as through exogenous factors. So basically what you can think of is maybe in queuing systems where the input is heavy tilt, for example, input that you require heavy tilt surface times, that leads to this notion that you also get heavy tilt queue lengths or heavy tilt waiting times. So because of the job sizes that go into it are heavy tilt, that also lead to heavy tilt waiting times. Also, this can be found in this textbook that I give here. And finally, maybe an explanation that is given very often is through self-organized criticality. And of course, there's a reason why I list this as last, because I do want to explain this more in terms of a cascading failure model. So let me start. So where do the heavy tilts actually occur in cascading failure models? So I will start with self-organized criticality. Okay. So if you look at Wikipedia, what is self-organized criticality? There's this very vague notion. So what it says is that self-organized criticality is a property of dynamical systems that have a critical point as an attractor. Their macroscopic behavior thus displays the spatial or temporal scale invariance characteristic of the critical point of a phase transition, but without the need to tune control parameters to precise value, because the system effectively tunes itself as it evolves towards criticality. So instead of tuning your parameters to be in the state of criticality, the system does it for you. So I still find this very, very vague. But if you look at really explicit models that say that display self-organized criticality, it becomes much more tangible. So that's what we're going to do now. By looking at the work that actually initiated this explanation, the self-organized criticality notion. And that is work by Baktang and Liesenfeld. And they proposed an Abelian sandpile model, and that works as follows. So you start with a n by n grid that contains at every node a certain number of grains. Every node can only contain a certain capacity of the number of nodes. And that is actually the degree of that node. So in this case, if the number of grains exceeds 4, then you become unstable. So the cascade may be initiated by dropping a grain of sand or grain onto uniformly at random at one of those nodes. So suppose that happens in the middle of the network, then it becomes unstable if the number of grains at that node actually exceeds 4. So what you do then is that you topple all those grains to your neighbors. So in this particular example, you see that the 4 grains are actually expanded to its neighbors. So these 3 nodes become stable again, but there's still a node that is then unstable. And you can continue this process. So that is also what happens, etc., etc., etc. And now you see something special happening. You see that the grains actually, that's the nodes that become unstable is actually at the border of the grids. And that means that they can fall off. And once they are fall off of the boundary, then they are lost. So in this particular example, you see that there's one lost grain from this node, and then this node also loses a grain. This one will also lose a grain. This one will lose now 2 grains. And then the system is stable again. So this is how this Abelian sandpile model works. I hope that is clear. And the notion of interest is actually the number of toppling events. And quite surprisingly, maybe, is that the number of toppling events has a Pareto tail. So this was quite revolutionary when this was introduced in the late 80s. And a large body of work actually went with this notion. So this was initiated by the works of Bartang and Wieseveld. Many variations and extensions of this original model were considered from that point onwards. So also generalizations on, for example, random graphs, for example, the Erdos-Renyi graph, where you see that the exponent becomes -1/2, but also on scale-free networks, where you actually have also different behaviors depending on the degree distribution gamma. One side note maybe that I do want to mention is that many empirical studies that are done comparing this BTW type of sandpile models to blackout size distributions. And this is also, I will say a little bit more about it maybe later on. So now we see how self-organized criticality is linked to cascading failures. How about the other explanations? Do they also, is that also one of the reasons why they emerge in cascading failure models? Well, let's see. So what do random walks, for example, have to do with cascading failure models? Let's see. So actually quite a lot. And for that, I will introduce a very basic cascading failure model. So suppose that you have n components that all have an independent and identically distributed surplus capacity, which I denote by CIN. And each failure loads all the remaining components by a certain load surge. And we are interested in the number of failed lines. This was actually initiated, or a generalization, by a cascade model that was introduced by Dobson and co-authors. And we made it a little bit more general later on, me and my co-authors. So if you want to visualize that, you can do so using this figure. So you have certain capacities, and you can order them from smallest to highest. There's a initial disturbance, and then you see that it exceeds the first or the capacity of the line or the component with the lowest capacity. So that initiates another load surge, etc., until you see that the third time that happens, everything is stable again. Okay, so I display that in of star network, where you have edges that fail. So in this particular case, you see two edge failures. So if you want to know the number of failures, what needs to happen is for the probability that the number of failures exceeds a certain k, then up till the point k, the capacity should be insufficient to meet the load surges. So that is what's over here. And if you actually plot that into a figure where you see the capacities that are plotted over here and the load surges are here, then it's the failure size is basically the first time you pass that line. So that already feels very much like the first passage time of a random walk. And basically that is where I'm going here. So if you rewrite this notion a little bit, so suppose that these simplicity, suppose that the CIs have a continuous distribution function, and that you can write a load surge function in this manner, then basically you can order them to a ordered uniform distribution. And if you think of ordered uniform distributions, then you also know that exponentials, given that the n+1 exponential has a certain value, you can normalize everything basically, and it's the same in distribution as a uniform distribution. So in that sense, you can rewrite everything, and here you really see this random walk that needs to stay above a certain boundary. And that at some point, the random walk returns to a certain point. Okay. So write the random walk in this way, which is 1 minus an exponential, and that needs to stay above that boundary, given that in the end it returns to 0 approximately. Okay, so it's the first passage time of that random walk. So we translated the problem into a standard problem that we actually know quite well how to solve that. So this was the topic actually from a work that I did with Vitaly Wachtel and Bert Zwart. And we did it a little bit more generally, of course. We didn't consider simply the 1 minus exponential, so we did a little bit more generally than that. But our theorem actually says that that it still leads to a power law tail. So if we look at the tail here, then this is basically a constant. And this is the power law tail times with an exponent minus a half. So the first passage time for random walk bridge actually has a power law tail. In case the k is properly 4 of the n, so k can be alpha n or smaller than that. And this is actually very easy to prove yourself, to be honest, because it's only half a page of proof. So I included that in this talk just because it's not that difficult. And what you have to do is you have to use a lot of local convergence theorems. So you start unconditioning over here, and then you can look at the position of your random walk at time k. So you know that, so if you have a reverse random walk where with mean 0 and a finite variance, basically you know that this goes to a normal distribution, and that this goes to, we also understand quite well, it's a constant times a Rayleigh distribution. So this is something we also quite know, quite understand quite well. So if you know where it converges to, then basically you can plug in under some minor technical conditions, you can plug in your formula and do the integration and find the formula. Yeah. So this is how you end up with this result. We also looked at a more difficult case, to be honest, where you are very close to the return point. And then you really have to take care of your boundary cases. And you see that this phase transition also happens because if you think of that Brownian, the random walk that needs to stay is above a boundary, that will go up with, so the typical behavior will go up by square root of k, but you have to return to the 0, so, or to the boundary in n minus k time. And if that is of a different order than the k, then of course you see that something's got to give. So so you have to really distinguish where the boundary is, and then you really see you also see this phase transition happening. I don't want to go into detail too much about it, but I just wanted to highlight that it can become more involved if you look at cases where the k is closer to the boundary, to the return point. Sorry. So maybe a slight additional note. We have this very classical cascading failure model, basic cascading failure model. It can be very much generalized to other graphs as well. This is something I have done with my colleague Lorenzo Federico, but you have to say something about what happens if there are disconnections, for example. So you have to, so if, for example, you can say that once you disconnect your graph, then what happens here, if you have failures in one component, it doesn't affect other components anymore, but you have to include that in your load search function in some way. But you can do that. You can see under some conditions where the power law actually prevails. We have shown this rigorously for a connected configuration model, and we have also very good intuition and numerical studies that suggest when the Pareto tails also prevails in other graphs. Yeah, it was a little bit technical to say something about that here, I think. Okay, so that has the relationship with the random walks. So I already see that I'm almost 40 minutes in the talk, so I will be a little bit more brief about the other explanations.
We started about 7 minutes late, Fiona. So you have
okay.
An extra 7 minutes.
Okay, good, Seva. But I will manage, don't worry. Heavy tails can also emerge as a consequence of phase transitions, and we see that, for example, in critical branching processes, we know the classical setting very well, we understand it very well. Well, as I mentioned before, there's a strand of literature that uses that branching model ID with statistical analysis of historical and simulated blackout data that are caused by this cascading failure. So I just wanted to mention that strand of literature exists, and if you're interested in it, you can look at the papers that I list over here. So although I mentioned Keston's recursive relation as a possible explanation why heavy tails emerge, they don't have a lot of relation with cascading failure models. So for that reason, we can already neglect looking at that. And also, if you consider network topology, for example, why heavy tails emerge there, well, they appear naturally through the network topology in cascading failure models. So it makes more sense to see that in terms of specific examples. So I will not give an example on this explanation. Instead, I will focus on the final explanation that we have not considered yet, and that is through exogenous factors in cascading failure models. So why do the heavy tails in cascading failure models emerge driven by exogenous factors? For that to understand, well, that's more difficult than you are. Surprisingly, it hasn't been looked at it that often yet. Although it is very well understood in certain areas, such as queuing or finance, this hasn't been, or relatively unexplored in cascading failure analysis. And also specifically, for example, in blackout analysis. So that is quite surprising. So that really prompted me and my co-authors to look at this notion in relatively recent work still. And actually, Bert already gave a talk about this topic in an earlier SNAPP seminar. So if you really want to know more about it, then I invite you to look at this talk. Here in this talk, I will actually only give a brief overview of the main messages here, to also show how we can use the insights that we use, that you have for this type of model to design good mitigation strategies to prevent large-scale failures. Okay. So the cascading failure model that you can keep in mind is as follows. So there's a network, a connected network, where you have nodes that represent certain locations, and each of those nodes have a certain demand, X, which is independent and identically distributed on Pareto tails. The demand has to be met by a certain supply that is also generated at the nodes. We assume that there is no loss in the network, so the total supply should meet the total demand. The edges, they can transmit the excesses of supply to other nodes that have a shortage of supply in order to meet the total demand. Naturally, those edges do have certain capacity limits, and that is given by the capital F. Okay, so this is the general idea, but of course you need to be a little bit more specific. So if you really have to look at a specific model, you need to say something about how you set those edge capacity limits, which we call the design stage. You have to say something about how much supply is generated at each of the nodes, and you have to give a certain flow model, how much how much flow is at each of the edges. And finally, you have to say something about how the cascade will be initiated, and if there are failures, how the flow is redirected through the rest of the graph. Okay, so in our paper, we do that explicitly. We set the line limits as follows. Well, maybe I should explain the operational stage first. So the operational stage is by solving the convex optimization problem that we know from certain power dynamics. So we solve a convex optimization problem called the DC OPF that gives a supply G, that is the solution of that convex optimization problem. And the flows are given by the DC power flow model. We set the line limits as if there were no capacity limits, and we set them as a fraction of that. So that's how we set the line limits. And to start off the cascade, we initially start failing a line uniformly at random, and then failures occur subsequently according to the relative highest exceedance first principle. So the edge that has relatively the highest exceedance will be failed next, and then the flow is redirected through through the model or through the network according to the DC power flow model. And when a graph disconnects, we shed the loads, or we lose the supply proportional to all the nodes. And the objective is to find out what the amount of lost supply is. So maybe this is still a little bit fake. So I provide an example next. So maybe that's a little bit easier. And the nice thing about this example is that you don't have to understand what is linear, what matrix phi is. So let's start. So suppose that from the design stage and the operational stage, you have a line limit of 5/24 and 1/24 for all the lower line limits, lower lines, and for the upper edges, you have a line. You have the limit 5/24. 5/24. Okay. Suppose that we look at the demand factor that is a unit vector simply, where basically there's only demand of 1 at the top node and the other ones have no demand. Okay. So apparently, if you solve the DC OPF, which is just a convex optimization problem, then the solution is as follows. You generate lambda over 6 at all of those nodes, and 1 minus 5/6 lambda at the top node. So basically, everything that you generate in the other nodes that have no demand really flows upwards to that upper node. Yeah, and that also explains why the flows are as they are, because lambda over 6 is produced by this node, and that has to go upward in a symmetric fashion. So lambda over 6 divided over 4 edges is lambda over 24, right? Okay. Suppose there's an initial line failure and that occurs at one of those top edges. Okay, that means that no flow can be directed over that line anymore. So the flow that was initially on this line needs to be redirected backwards and then upwards again. So everything went upwards. So this has to go backwards. 1 over 24 minus 5 over 24 is minus 4/24, but we only look at the yeah, so I could have included minus here, but whatever. So then this becomes 1 over 6 lambda, and then this needs to be directed upwards. So you can really recalculate what the flows need to be at the other lines in this way. You see that that all of those lines are still exceeding its line capacity, because we only look at the case that lambda is larger than 3 over 4. And the exceedance is highest at this particular line. So that's the next one that fails. This node becomes disconnected. So this, whatever this produced in supply is lost, which is lambda over 6. So the only thing that really flows over these lines are still lambda over 6 divided by 3. And you see that that is lambda over 18, etc. So these are still exceeding its line capacity. So these also fail. And then we end up in a final stage where everything is stable again. Yeah? Okay. So two nodes become disconnected and both produce lambda over 6. So the total loss supply is lambda over 3. So this is kind of how it works. And you can, of course, generalize that using the complete model. But what our main theorem says is the following, that even though that if you look at the amount of loss supply, that if the demands are all independent and identically distributed with Pareto tail, then under some technical conditions, the amount of lost supply also has this Pareto tail with a different constant, but with the same Pareto tail or the same exponent as the initial demand factors, demands were had. We can actually give an explicit expression for the pre-factor. And it can be done as follows. Let's see. And the key idea for the proof for this is that the only dominant scenario that we have to consider for T to be very large is when there is a single location that has that large demand. So in the example that we gave before, I gave the unit factor. Of course, I did that for a reason, because that's actually the only type of scenario that is interesting to consider. So what do we mean by the only dominant scenario for T to be large is when there is a single location that has a large demand? That is more formally given like this. So the probability for a large T, and that the total demand of the other nodes is larger than epsilon of this one, actually goes down by x to the power minus 2 and alpha. So it's very unlikely that there are also other nodes that have a very large supply compared to the compared to the biggest, to the node with the biggest demand. Sorry. So this actually suggests that we don't have to consider all the cases. We only have to consider the cases where there is a single node that has a large demand and the other ones only have like epsilon, smaller than epsilon fraction of it. So if you normalize this framework by dividing by the largest demand node, and solve this DC-OPF for generation factor with respect to the demand factor only E1, you can find an explicit solution. So this was done by checking the KKT constraints, and then you can actually see that this solution is the solution of the convex optimization problem, non-trivial to do that, but or to find a solution, at least that was not non-trivial. But here we go. And then what you can do is that you that you can show that all the cascade sequences for the demand factors satisfying this form, where all these X2, for all the demands that are smaller than the large demand node, they all converge to the same cascade sequence as if you have a unitary demand factor. So you just use that to conclude that that the T is approximately of this size, and you sum over all the possibilities that you can have an initial edge failure and for a node to be the largest one. So so these are basically the 4 steps that you do to show the result that we have. So if you didn't really fully understand this, then the only message that I really want you to remember is that the scale-free behavior of that failure size T is driven by the scale-free nature of the demand distributions. The internal dynamics have non-trivial but minor effect. They only affect the prefactor, not the fact that it is a Pareto tail. Okay. So if we look at our explanations, we see that we've gone through them all. But naturally, many more cascading failure models exist. Think of academic models, they are very much related to cascading failure models, transportation systems, power transmission systems that don't consider heavy tails, to be honest. There are many cascading failure models on that as well. And there are many more notable works, and there were too many to mention here. I think that's, that we really lose focus if I mention them all. But the key message I want to give from this talk is maybe that despite the simple nature of cascading failures, they really capture essential features of failure processes in many settings, and they really allow for a wide range of application areas. They can be used to study a vast collection of possible behaviors, and currently many questions and directions remain unexplored. So I invite you all to start working on it, or maybe not explicitly on where I'm working on, but at least there's many things that can be done. So there are, of course, many possible new directions because there are so many unexplored avenues that that exist here. There's also many options and many opportunities to grasp. So, for example, already if you look at the final cascading failure model that we saw just before, where the message was that the scale-free nature of the input actually drives the scale-free tail behavior of the failure size. There are many questions that emerge when you think of this. So, for example, we only looked in this specific model at finite connected graphs. So any graph is a fine, at least as long as it's not scalable. So at least as long as you say there are n nodes and n is fixed. Then this result holds. But how does it work for scalable graphs, so random graphs, for example, or maybe lattices or rings? Yeah, maybe that's a little bit too simple, but for other scalable graphs, because then you have 2 parameters that can grow. So is it still as simple as this key message? So maybe if the growth very large, or if the network grows very fast, then this message still or doesn't grow very fast, then this message still holds. But maybe there's different type of behavior if you if the growing of the network is different, or related to the demand size distribution. So it's quite interesting to see how this works for scalable graphs. or maybe if there are more constraints and dependencies that exist there. So for example, if the amount of generation that you can, the amount of supply that you can generate at the nodes, if that is constrained, for example, then the different type of behavior may emerge, or maybe it's done not because of a single node that has a very large demand, or maybe then it's because there are several nodes in the network that have a high demand. So then it's not a concept of a single big jump, but a concept of several big jumps. And of course, you want to get those insights to do something with it. So what can we do to prevent those large-scale failures? What we get out of this is that not all scenarios have to be explored. So you don't have to consider all possible demand factors that that can lead to a cascade. You only have to look at unitary demand factors. So that really reduces the space that you have to consider, and then you can really use maybe some learning algorithm to decide, for example, where to place an additional edge, or which lines to give additional capacity, such that really you lower the prefactor of that power law tail, or maybe even get rid of it completely. That may be difficult because then you have to put in a lot of capacity, so maybe that's not possible, but at least there's a very rich open questions that you can look at in that respect. With that, well, I kept it shorter, but then at least we're now in time, Seva. So with that, I would like to conclude this talk.
Thanks very much, Fiona. Thanks for a very nice talk. I hope others can join me in giving you a virtual round of applause. Thanks very much, and let me open the floor to questions. If somebody wants to ask a question, I think just unmuting yourself and speaking should be fine. Let me perhaps use my host privileges and ask you a question. It's actually related to something you touched upon there in your second possible new direction. I was wondering about the assumption that demands are IID. So I have a sort of multifaceted question. How reasonable do you think that is from the practical point of view? How far do you think we could go away from that? And do you think we could see something like light-tailed demands leading to heavy-tailed, to heavy-tailed failure sizes?
Yeah, so of course it's not too realistic. It depends on what type of application you look at. But if you look, for example, at the blackout type of application, then independency is, of course, never really the case. There's time, of course, that's at 5, 6 o'clock in the evening. There's always more demand than at 12 o'clock in the afternoon or at night, etc., etc. So there are many dependencies that exist there. But the difficulty is how to include that in those models. So how are you going to ensure that there's a certain dependency in there? Because it's too easy to say that it's a scalable alpha times or a weighted version, for example, of a general distribution X. I think that's too simplistic. And then you might also not capture everything. Maybe include some noise. I think it's very difficult to get a good model already to model the dependencies, but if it's there, then maybe look at what can we do then. But I already am stuck a little bit by how can we include those dependencies that make in a way that makes sense. Okay, well, yes, you've thought about it for a long time. I just had this question while listening, and when I saw the IID assumption, it was. Thank you. Any other questions?
Okay. Okay, then let me thank Fiona again, and we can all give you another virtual, at least, round of applause. Thanks for your talk, and sorry again to everyone about the technical issues in the beginning. Right, and we hope to see you in a couple of weeks at the next seminar. Thanks, everyone.